Okay, so we've got about half an hour or so. 2 o'clock we've got to stop. Okay, 25 minutes. I'm going to try and say what I'm going to say in 20 minutes then, because it would be really nice to create a little bit of space for some discussion or to hear from you guys. I'm Lucie Shuker. I'm the Director of Research at YouthScape, and we're a Luton-based youth work charity. We've been doing youth work in Luton for 25 years, and then more recently have just begun poking a head above the water and going, ooh, we've got some things we want to show you and what's going on over there, and become a bit more national. And I mostly just direct myself to the biscuit tin and back. I don't really direct very much. There's a small team of me and someone else on half a day a week. So I've got a more important title than I probably am. But what I want to do this afternoon is just share a little bit of research. That is the lens that I'm coming to this from, because that's my background, and share some thoughts about how we in Luton and in YouthScape, how we're responding to some of the mental health needs of children and young people in the schools where we work, but then hopefully to create a bit of space for you guys to contribute to. Do we have any mental health professionals in the room? I don't know whether that's good. I was about to say it's good news. Actually, I think that's bad news. I was sort of hoping, yes, we do. I was hoping that we might have some more as well who could kind of jump in and share your wisdom and knowledge, but you're stuck with me. So let's get going. I think probably if you've been paying any attention, if your eyes have been open, if you've been listening to the radio, you will be aware of something that feels like, at times, a crisis. In terms of young people's mental health. Whether or not that's your primary experience or whether you're just picking that up from the general culture, being a teenager has always been rough. I'm sure we have our own memories of that, but something is happening and it is not good. And at a time in in young people's lives when at least the hope is that there is some lightness, there is some fun, there is a sense of this period of time that, though conflicted and difficult in lots of ways, it's also really precious. You're not yet fully an adult, and yet at this time, so many young people are so heavily burdened in all sorts of ways. And you'll be familiar with some of those themes. Apologies if you can't quite see at the back here, but an increase in anxiety and depression. A sense for many young people that at the core of who they are not okay, they do not like themselves, and they are not sure that they are acceptable, that they're good enough. And we've had these themes emerging already at the front there. Low resilience in dealing with emotions. That's an interesting one, and in some ways I would potentially recast that, because it would be easy to say that, and some people write this generation off as snowflakes who don't know how to cope with the world. But if you look at what they're having to cope with, challenges that none of us had to cope with as teenagers, we cannot say that they just have poor resilience. What we probably do have to say is we need to do so much more to help them to navigate this world, which is unprecedented in the platforms they need to navigate, the possibilities of what the future is going to look for them, the breakdown of the spaces that should be safe and create a sense of stability. And so for many of them, they are turning to damaging ways of coping. Self-harm is one of the ones we're going to talk about. I will just pause there to say there are other things that are not getting worse, they're getting better. Because when we talk about this, it can sometimes feel like it's just all a terrible story. But teenage pregnancies have gone down. Teenage drinking has gone down. Teenage smoking has gone down. The first age at which young people have sex has remained pretty stable the whole time. So it's not just a story that everything's getting worse. And we've got to resist that kind of narrative. But there is something specific, I think, happening around some aspects of mental health. So I'm going to use a particular study to share some stats with you, and there are plenty of reports out there that you could go and look at if you're interested in statistics. But this is the one that I think is particularly powerful and particularly interesting. And part of the reason I think this is one to pay attention to is because quite often you'll get a charity, YouthScape will do this, we'll kind of commission a survey and it'll be 1,000 young people and it'll try to be representative and it'll give you a snapshot of what's going on a particular day. This study, which is called Mental Health of Children and Young People, is the third part of a longitudinal study. So the first time it was done was in 1999, then it was done in 2004, and now it's been done again 2017. And it was released November last year. So it actually is showing us whether things are getting better or worse. But beyond that, it's not just longitudinal, it also is showing us not just what young people say about themselves, but it is a questionnaire in which young people and teachers and parents they triangulate, it's kind of researcher term, the perspectives of those three. And then the questionnaires are separately clinically assessed to look for, is there evidence that there is a clinical disorder here? So it's not just a young person saying, I've got anxiety. It is someone clinically assessing three people's different perspectives. So in terms of the strength of that data, it doesn't get much stronger. It's not perfect, but it's a pretty strong piece of research. Those are standardised assessments. And what we see is that there has been an upward trend in the prevalence of any mental health disorder for 11 to 15-year-olds, this one is. Nearly 1 in 7 teenagers has a disorder now compared to 1 in 9 in 1999. And for the whole of childhood, so kind of 5 to 19 is their age range, it's 1 in 8 who had at least one mental disorder when assessed in 2017. If you're in the front row, you can probably tell. It's always worth looking. When you see a chart, you just see things going up and you're like, but when you've got to look at the numbers on the left, don't you? Which tell you actually how big is this increase. So the numbers on the left, it's from 10% to 14%. So it's going up, but actually one of the things that I sort of thought was interesting when I saw this for the first time was, actually that's not as bad as I thought it would be. I thought that would be worse. Given the amount we have heard about how awful things are, I actually thought we'd see a bigger kind of point increase from 2004 around the prevalence of mental health disorders. So it's going up, but you could say it's not going up maybe as much as we feared. And I think, yeah, we'll get into why that is. So, but when you look at that, what you've got to do obviously is break it down. That's all young people, but what does it tell us about specific groups of young people? Well, one of the things that comes out really clearly from this is that the likelihood of a mental health disorder increases with age. So the older you get, the more likely you are to have a clinically assessed mental health disorder. Now, without going into the details of what all of that is, you can interpret that in terms of what we do in different ways. On the one hand, you might say, we need to focus all our resources and intervention, therefore, on this upper age bracket. And there's certainly a question about where, how do older teenagers have sufficient resource there? But there's also a question of, is this a symptom of a failure of early intervention? Are we spending enough time and attention and money on building the resilience amongst primary school age children, so that by the time they do become older teenagers, these disorders are less likely to emerge? And again, I think this doesn't answer that question, but we shouldn't just look at that and go, we just focus on the older ones. I think one of the things that practically raises in terms of support is that often if you're in some kind of charity or some kind of service, you stop what you're doing at 18 because you're no longer a child, are you? But what this data shows, it goes up to kind of 19, and certainly the stuff beyond that from surveys with adults is many of this stuff, that's the point where it's just getting worse and worse. So we are seeing extended services increasingly where people can get the funding and they've got the vision, they are going, we can't stop at 18. We know childhood is extending, so what does it mean to continue to provide that kind of support? And the mental health team in YouthScape, certainly one of the things that when I had a conversation with the lady who leads Illumina, which is our online self-harm project, she said, we see these spikes at the transition to secondary school and at the point of leaving school. And so this sort of made sense to her in particular. But then we've also got to look at it by gender. And this is probably one of the more shocking kind of pieces in this report, that when we're looking at girls in particular, the prevalence of mental health disorders really sharply increases in older adolescents. And 17 to 19-year-old girls are kind of particularly vulnerable. So if you can't see, on the left is 11 to 16-year-olds. So the darker pink are the boys, naturally, it's a boy's colour. The lighter pink are the girls, and then the right-hand side, the girls, you see it just shoot up. So it actually goes down for boys between 17 and 19, but it shoots up sharply for girls between the age of 17 to 19. And if anyone's got an 18-year-old daughter, you may be going, aha. There are the research shows that 10% of girls have an emotional disorder like anxiety or depression, and it's 6% of boys. And those rates increase with age. There's another study called Health Behaviour in School-Aged Children, which is actually done across Europe. And the Scottish sample for that study looked at some gender differences around mental health. And one of the things that was interesting in that was that there was a gender difference, not in the number of close friends that boys and girls actually have, but in how far they felt able to lean on them for emotional support. This won't be a surprise to you, potentially, but girls felt much more able to lean on their friends for emotional support than boys do. We had last week, I can't remember exactly the phrase, but it's National Suicide Awareness Day. And you would have seen that in the news. And I think we have known for a while now that for men, suicide is a huge problem. And so when you hear things like that teenage boys don't lean on their friends for support, you think we have some work to do. On the one hand, the problem that we're seeing here with girls announces itself in this data more sharply, but we know that boys need support to know how to manage difficult things in life, to manage suffering and strain. So one of the things that we're doing about that is working with the Salvation Army to develop a resource that's going to be coming out at the end of this year that's specifically about supporting mental health of boys. So I don't quite know yet what that's going to look like. It's quite exciting. But if that's something that would benefit you in your context, then do sort of take a look at the YouthScape kind of store at the end of the year. But it's not just that it's all disorders that are equally kind of on the rise. In fact, some of them are staying actually pretty stable, and some are increasing. So emotional disorders are the most common of the 4 types of disorder that this study captured. And within that, the most common is anxiety. So 7.2% of 5 to 19-year-olds had an anxiety disorder. And again, I don't know whether that figure you think, oh, that's not as many as I would have thought, or actually that's really concerning, that's much higher. But it's worth, of course, remembering that when we say the word anxiety, that captures a whole range, doesn't it, of things. It captures that fear and panic about an exam, which is just a fairly normal reaction for any of us, down to that debilitating incapacity to cope with life. And so we're talking here about anxiety disorder, which is at that more kind of extreme end. There was a programme on Radio 4 recently called Generation Anxious. I don't know if any of you heard it, but I heard it in the car, and actually they had some people coming and discussing this sense of anxiety has been the backdrop for many young people's lives. That's really worth a listen if that's something that in particular is affecting you in your context, the young people that you support and work with. But all other types of disorder, so they had behavioural, hyperactivity, and then less common disorders, have actually remained stable, roughly stable between 1999, 2004, and then 2017. So 0.6% of 11 to 19-year-olds were identified as having an eating disorder, and 1% with autism, and those rates are fairly stable. It doesn't mean that all those young people get services. In fact, we know that so many parents are really struggling to get access to services. It means that even at the point where people are becoming more able to identify concerns and refer, that it doesn't mean there's not huge pressure on the system. But what this is picking up is, if you just went and assessed a nationally representative sample, these are the numbers who actually have autism or those other forms of disorder. One of the things that this study also did was introduced body dysmorphic disorder for the first time. So in the previous times they collected data, they didn't ask about this, but we've become more aware that this is a real thing and something that is really difficult for a number of children and young people who have complicated and painful relationships to their body. I think it would be interesting if we did that in this context, or in any other adult context, to find out whether we are doing better on that. I think this is one of those areas of being adult that's really hard. I'm not sure there's many of us that have the most fantastic relationship to having a body, but Christianity has so much to speak positively about what it means to be created and created good. So it was introduced for the first time, and 1 in 20 So 5.6% of 17 to 19-year-old girls suffer with BDD. And I think that's really high. 1 in 20, when they look in the mirror, what they see is radically different, negatively, to how other people see them, with all that creates, all the troubles that creates. There was a YouGov survey of just over 1,000 British teenagers last year, and it showed that 31% of 13 to 19-year-olds feel ashamed of their body shape. Again, I think, without not wanting to single young people out, shame around our bodies is a really common experience. I don't think that's exclusive to adolescents. But it also is something which just creates a huge opportunity for adults to deal with and address shame about bodies. And is it possible? Do we just give up and think, being a teenager, you're always going to be awkward, you're always going to not like what's in the mirror, or can that shift? Can we see those numbers go down? Okay. Self-harm. Again, we have seen basically a number of studies over the last kind of 5-6 years, and all of them have showed an increase in reported self-harm, admissions to hospital, people showing up to GP surgeries. We know that lots of young people never show up to those services, and so the prevalence rates do kind of vary between different kinds of research, but across all of them we have essentially seen an increase. And those rates kind of vary between kind of 10 to 11% up to kind of 30% of young people. And I don't think I put it on here, but there's a piece of work that was done by Selfharm UK, which is a kind of piece of work within YouthScape that asked young men about their experiences of self-harm, because we know that it's more young women than young men, but a really high proportion of young men said that they hurt themselves as a way of coping. The way that they did that was different. So they might go to the gym and work out until they damaged or hurt themselves, until they had an injury. They might hit their head against a wall. They might not self-injure, but they would harm themselves in different ways. And so we need to, when we're looking at the young people we support, we need to just be conscious that while that often might show itself more easily amongst young women, that young men really are coping with self-harm as well. So there were some groups of young people that were more likely to have a mental health disorder amongst those that were surveyed in 2017. White British 5 to 19-year-olds were 3 times more likely than black British or Asian British children to have a disorder. And that's really interesting. I don't think this study shows us a huge amount about why. But again, one of the things that we can't say is we can't just say it's those that are known to services, because this wasn't about going to the GP surgery or going to some charity and saying, who's on your books? Oh, you know, the black British and Asian British kids aren't there. This was about randomly selecting homes, going into them and saying, could you fill out this questionnaire? So, yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting when we open up to, if we want to kind of ask questions about why that is. But 3 times as likely, that's something. Living in a low-income household or with a parent in receipt of income-related benefits was associated with higher rates of mental disorder. But, and I think this is interesting, there was no association with neighbourhood deprivation. So it is not just the case that if you happen to live in a postcode where lots of people are struggling, it's inevitable that you're going to have poor mental health. It's much more likely that it's what's going on in your immediate family that is going to make that difference. And the strain that those families are under, where you are receiving income support, or where a parent actually is struggling financially, or actually has kind of poor mental health themselves, those are the families, you're probably thinking about them now, those are the families where that early intervention work and that community really needs to come alongside and build resilience. So children with poor general health, special educational needs, or those with parents with poor mental health or in receipt of a disability-related benefit were also more likely to have a mental disorder than other children. At this point I thought, is there anything that's going well? Actually, I've already just told you most of the big things that are going well, but it came to mind that I had read something that had said, since 2002, weekly drinking among 15-year-olds in Scotland, anyone Scottish here? Yay, Charlie, has declined from 41% to 14% among boys. Isn't that good news? That's really good. Also, there's been an almost 10% increase in the number of boys brushing their teeth twice a day. So it's not all going badly. They're brushing their teeth and they're drinking less. And that is good for them and good for everybody else. So what does that mean? What does that mean, all of this? How are we doing? And when I say we, I mean the big we, kind of nationally. Well, services are strained. No big surprise there. The latest data shows that the average wait for treatment for children and young people's mental health service is 12 weeks. But if you're at the point of only just having got a referral, it feels like crisis. 12 weeks is a flipping long time. It is too long for a family to have to wait for support. And more than that, it's not just that the wait is too long, there's a postcode lottery when we're thinking about prevention services. So £14 per child is being spent on low-level preventative and early intervention services, even though these are the most important things that need to be happening. So the top 25% of local authority areas are spending about 1.1 million on prevention, and the bottom 25% are spending about 180,000. So we've got a real problem there. What's our role? I've just shared a quote here. Do you know what? I haven't actually put down who it's from, and now I can't remember. Well, that's a nightmare. I think it was in response to that report that was about waiting times. It was someone important who said, without investing in the largely untapped potential of the voluntary sector, churches, to serve the most marginalised young people, the government will fail to achieve its ambition to transform young people's mental health services, and ultimately will fail young people once more. There's no way we can spend ourselves out of this crisis. We need the whole community to support young people. But we are in the business of transforming mindsets, and when we talk about what prevention is, Harvey Whiteford, who's a professor at the University of Queensland, says, above all, prevention is about changing the way people think. And we know how to do that. We know how to do that. So, briefly, some things that we do at YouthScape that you might find helpful. One of the things we do is we try to focus on well-being. We try to acknowledge, as this diagram shows, that there is a difference between what might be diagnosed, so a diagnosed condition, and having no diagnosis, and then well-being. So maximum well-being or minimum well-being, because you may have a diagnosed condition, but it doesn't mean that you can't have support to have maximum well-being within that diagnosis. And I have a friend who is bipolar and would always say to me, life is really good and I am really well, because she has now learned to manage and she has got the support of a community in such a way that it does not affect her daily life most of the time. On the flip side, you may never see a service, you may never have a diagnosis, but life might be incredibly difficult. Your well-being might be incredibly poor. So we need to, although I just shared loads of stuff about disorders, we do need to think about this in the broad sweep of well-being. Secondly, we need to build resilience. So we talked about that word already. And these are 5 components of resilience that when we look at, I bet that if you're working with children and young people, you are doing this. You are building self-awareness. Some of the ways we might do that are kind of there as well. You are creating spaces for them to belong. You are modelling positive relationships. You're saying to them that your life matters, that you have purpose. And then finally, it might feel like a little bit of mental health jargon, but are you teaching them how to look after themselves, how to care for themselves, and take their well-being seriously enough that they can take responsibility for it and learn how to care for themselves? So, we have been trying to develop some resources. You may have seen these if you've been on the store, the YouthScape store, to help young people with this. So we've got a journal called Headstrong, which just is partly about self-care. It's for any young people, it's not a Christian resource, but we might have scandalously rephrased some biblical passages to make them kind of more for the Pinterest quote generation, as kind of like, yeah, this is just a self-help quote, oh, it's from Philippians, and put it in here for young people. For those who catastrophize, they may not have an anxiety disorder, but they just don't know how to cope with fear or anxiety. What if is a game they can play to think about what's the worst that could happen, and when or if that happened, what could you do? Have a look at that. We've got emoji dice with different kind of faces on them to help develop emotional literacy, because how can you manage your emotions if you don't even know what they are? If you cannot say, I feel whatever it is you feel. So I'm I'm rushing, aren't I? Inevitably. And finally, one of the things that we sort of do as well is offer training. So if it would be helpful for you to kind of have training in self-harm and anxiety or any of those things, do have a look at the YouthScape store. I will pause there. I was hoping I might give you a chance to play with these, but the room isn't really set up for that. So any comments or any questions?
Sorry, this is just a quick one. It's great that children, young people are drinking less. But I'm aware that what they quite like to do is fill those vape things with unpleasant things that I can't remember the name of, and get high on that. Yeah. So I'm just wondering whether that's a kind of we're not drinking is actually.
I mean, that point that until you meet the ultimate need, which is to know that you are loved, accepted, and have purpose in your life. To some extent, all those other games that we will play all the way through adolescence and into adulthood, you'll replace one fix with another. So I think it's just, that point was really just made, not to say, that everything's fine, but to say, we're just swapping our coping mechanisms. Yeah. Anybody else got a comment or a question?
How would it be best, so I do use some skills work, but one of the things with some of the parents is obviously working with them and obviously what they believe is best for their child. And obviously we have like a child who comes in who cries quite a lot, and it's the point where the parent obviously says that they don't want you to make a fuss of that, of how that happens, but trying to build on what you said on those points is what I'm trying to do. But she's totally against that, against trying to help support that in that way. How do you think would be best? It's so, I know it's hard, and it's like, and it's the point where it's like she won't let it cry, and it's like.
How old is this child?
She's just turned 16, and it's one of those things. It's like, but crying is probably the best thing for her right now.
Absolutely.
Like, how do you then help that child who wants that comfort, who wants to be able to come to you and say, I need help? But then the parents obviously finding out that and doesn't want that support for her in that way.
I mean, I don't know whether this is the right thing to say, but I would say at 16, you're close to adulthood. And there is, generally in terms of parental consent to various kinds of interventions, the child has quite a bit more choice than that sense of a parent preventing that child from receiving support. I would probably talk to someone else in the context. Is it a school or a charity or?
No, it's youth work.
It's youth work, okay. I don't think I would take that as meaning you can't do that work, that the parent doesn't want you to. It sounds like it's very important. So, but I'm afraid, I don't know, did you have something you wanted to?
At 16 she can consent herself.
Yeah. So if she gives consent to meet with you, that's she can do that. Do we need to finish there? Great. Thanks everybody.